Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. Now then, every day almost, all we hear is about the state of the economy and everyone's grumbling and so on. Apparently the government isn't doing enough and so on. I suppose this is a favorite comment of the public, but it is as it is. People are talking about the rising prices and so on. Today we thought we'd discuss various aspects of that, including the international dimension, especially because also we are attempting to avert or thwart attempts to take away GSP Plus, a concession which most of our companies exporting to Europe are fond of. Now then, to describe all this and a little bit more perhaps is Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, who's an attorney at law, and he has some experience in international matters. Very good evening to you, Dr. Gehan, and thank you very much for being on Newsline Live.
Good evening, good evening.
Now, I was going to ask you, how far is it true to say that balanced accountability balances international perception?
Well, I think the question you're asking has to be sort of approached in one way, right? I think ultimately we have to ask ourselves the question, what is reasonable for a country like Sri Lanka to actually commit to? What are the promises that are reasonable? And what are the promises that are not reasonable?
Yeah.
Right? So we have to have the ability to separate those two things. I think there are some countries that will impose conditions on a country as small as Sri Lanka that are unreasonable, and then we get into trouble because we overcommit or we promised what we can't deliver.
Right.
But then there are commitments that are reasonable, and that a country like Sri Lanka, a democratic country with a constitution that has enshrined fundamental rights, should indeed commit to, because they are reasonable and they are things that they should be doing anyway. So I think that is the dividing line between the international commitments that we should be subscribing to and the international commitments that we should not get ourselves pegged onto.
I see. And at what point though does I think before I ask you the question, I better say this. Sri Lanka is really its people value really and truly the democratic norms. Whether you are in Colombo or whether you are in a village in Monoragala, which is one of the more underprivileged places in the country, or whether you're in Jaffna or wherever you are, the people will always talk about their rights, ape bale and all that business. So in that context, at what point does it become unacceptable, or at what point does international requirements impinge on the sovereign nature of our country?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because we have to have some kind of litmus test. We have to have a frame of reference in terms of what should be accepted and what should not be accepted. I think that frame of reference has to be the Sri Lankan Constitution. This is the document that should govern the affairs of Sri Lanka. So if there is a commitment that we take on that aligns with or overlaps with our fundamental rights chapter, I think that's a no-brainer. We should be doing it anyway. So the people then would be quite glad to have these commitments fulfilled. Whereas if it's something that it comes outside the four corners of the Constitution, and we have had these things imposed on us even in the recent past, right? When that happens, I think the people have a right to be outraged, right to protest, and right to push back. So again, I think we need to have that frame of reference, and for me it's the Constitution.
Right. And with GSP Plus, it is of course a trade concession, as you said earlier in our little discussion. It's a trade concession. It's probably important to those who get its benefit, but what has that got to do? What has trade got to do with anything else?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an unusual scheme, because really here you're offering tariff concessions to a particular country based on its status, its vulnerability status in terms of whether it's lower middle income or lower income, and its compliance with its treaty obligations under 27 specific treaties dealing with human rights, labor and environmental law. Now that's a little bit strange, and I admit that, because this is a trade concession, it's tariffs on the one hand, but then human rights, environmental law and labor rights on the other. But that's the scheme that the EU and the European Parliament has set out, and it wants to incentivize countries, particularly vulnerable countries, to actually fulfill its international obligations, because there's a connection it's seeing between democratic values and human rights and good economics. I think that connection has been well established. So here what we're seeing is a scheme that's fairly unique, that's offered to Sri Lanka, and for Sri Lanka to actually secure this scheme, all it really needs to do is do nothing more than fulfill its obligations under international law and under our constitution, because it's our constitution that really matters. And really, if we fulfill our obligations under this constitution, my guess is that GSP Plus will never be an issue, because our constitution is essentially based on those same international norms.
And can you, one of the sort of sticking points, if you like, is in this whole business of ensuring the continuity of GSP Plus, is of course the various issues like the PTA, for example.
Oh yes, yes.
Can you go through us the sort of simple three things that will that is at the moment troubling the international community?
So the Prevention of Terrorism Act came into being in 1979 as a temporary provisions act, right? So it was not really meant to be a permanent fixture in our law, but it was brought in to deal with a particular issue at the time. Then it became a permanent fixture in our law, and it continued to have certain provisions that were not only incompatible with our international obligations, but incompatible with our constitution as well. So then we come to 2010, 5 years after we had first secured GSP Plus. In 2010, the European Commission writes a letter to our External Affairs Minister and tells us of 15 issues that needed to be dealt with in order for us to continue to enjoy GSP Plus.
Right.
And out of those 15 issues, one high priority issue was the non-compliance or the incompatibility of the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, with certain international provisions, international treaty provisions, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Torture Convention. Now, out of those 15, Sri Lanka was by and large able to fulfill 14 conditions. So the PTA issue was the only outstanding issue when we actually recovered or reclaimed GSP Plus in 2017. So we actually recovered it on the express promise that the PTA will be dealt with, will be reformed. The three main issues that you quite rightly point to: number one, confessions. Right now, under our ordinary law, under the evidence ordinance, a confession to a police officer is not admissible as evidence against that suspect. That's special protection. That's the ordinary law.
Yeah.
Under the PTA, a confession to a police officer ranking ASP will be admissible in a court of law against that person. And what's more, it is on that person to prove that the confession was involuntary. So the burden of proof is in fact shifted onto the accused rather than on the prosecutor, which is again a complete deviation from the ordinary law, right? So that's number one, and that's a fairly straightforward incompatibility with our constitution and international law. Number two, producing a suspect before a judge within a reasonable period of time. Under ordinary law, it's 24 hours. In some cases, it's 48 hours. But under the PTA, there is absolutely no requirement to produce the suspect before a judge.
For any length of time?
For a length of up to 18 months, because I'll come to the third issue. You can have a detention order that's renewed over and over again for a period of 18 months without trial. So this requirement is also not met under the PTA, and that requirement is the basic requirement that allows a judge to actually view a suspect and see how the suspect has been treated, because that's a basic sort of safeguard.
Whether he's had his jaws rearranged or anything like that.
Absolutely. So that safeguard is removed under the PTA.
Right.
Number three is this long-term detention issue. under the PTA, you can have detention for up to 18 months without trial. Whereas under most jurisdictions in the world, that is a length that is not acceptable.
Right.
So I think.
And our ordinary law?
Under ordinary law, you have to either remand the person, or you have to release the person. Before 24 hours, you have to produce the person before
24 hours.
The magistrate, and the magistrate can decide to either remand the suspect or release the person on bail. That option is not available under the PTA. So those are the three main issues, and any person on the street can understand that these are issues that are incompatible with basic decency, basic civilized society, right?
So basically, Dr. Gehan, the way I see it is that when we are implementing this PTA, we are only making our investigating authority, or the police or whoever who's investigating the matter, intelligence, whoever, we are only making them a little bit more lax, lazy, for want of a better word, because they've got, instead of 24 hours in which they've got to quickly do this thing and prove to a magistrate, they are having, with some aspects, 18 months to do this blessed thing. 18 months seems to be a lot of time for somebody to be without their liberty.
You're absolutely right. And I think because terrorism offences are often complex, there is a compromise that is often recommended, that even if you can't produce evidence within that short period of time, a detention order should not exceed 30 days. So actually, some of the law reforms that we have had in this country, including the proposals that were formulated by the Law Commission of Sri Lanka, actually had a compromise position where a detention order can be extended up to 30 days. And after that, the person has to be either released or placed in remand custody.
It does sound almost fair and reasonable to have, say, 30 days, because after all, there is complexities.
Absolutely, and that seems to be the standard that is adopted in a lot of countries. So actually, we have a set of proposals that were put together in 2016, and the government can just adopt those proposals if it wants to deal with these issues and make sure that GSP Plus isn't actually at risk.
Then, of course, comes the multi-billion rupee question. Why, when this is ever so simple to do, why is the government, not only this government, but all governments who are guilty of not addressing this, why are they guilty of that, of not addressing it? Why can't they do it? We had in the Yapalani government maybe a better chance because they appeared to be more conducive to what the rest of the world is saying. And so why wasn't it done? Why didn't they want to amend these draconian issues?
So let's start with the previous government, right? Previous government had an excellent opportunity to change the PTA and deal with this problem permanently. What happened was it received these proposals from the Law Commission, and the Law Commission is not just any old commission. It's a commission that comprises very eminent legal personalities. Very senior lawyers were serving on that committee, and they came up with a set of proposals, just an 8-page document that did the job, right? So the previous government had everything on a platter. It could have actually adopted those proposals. Instead, what it did was it went for a very ambitious project, which was to overhaul the PTA completely and replace it with a comprehensive law which was very complex and long, and it was called the Counterterrorism Act. And you know what happened to the CTA. It was challenged, people opposed it, it never came to pass. And in fact, people also compared the CTA with the PTA. My own view is that the CTA was marginally better than the PTA, but it was not so much better than that everyone wanted to embrace it immediately. There was a lot of opposition, particularly from human rights groups and civil society. And even the EU was not particularly happy with the draft that came out. And I don't think we would have got GSP Plus just because we passed the CTA. There were still problems with it. So really, that was a lost opportunity. Now, this government initially didn't really signal that it was interested in reforming the PTA. What it did was it said that it's going to continue with the PTA until more recently, when this issue of GSP Plus came up, it decided that it's going to appoint a committee and introduce some reforms. Now, we haven't seen what those reforms actually entail. If those reforms deal with these three issues, then I think we're on the right track. So without looking at those reforms, it's very difficult for me to comment on where we stand right now. I think the current Justice Ministry has a very competent team, a very efficient team. And if they really analyze this issue carefully, I'm pretty sure that they are perfectly capable of producing an excellent draft. But I haven't seen that draft, so it's difficult to know where we stand.
Right. On that note, let's take a look at this evening's headlines for the primetime news from News First. Join us straight back after this break. And very good evening. Welcome to Newsline Live. We are in conversation with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, who is an attorney at law and with some specialization in international law. Thank you once again, Dr. Gehan, for being part of the program. We've been discussing the draconian almost PTA, and you've compared it with the CTA. But what else is, what can this government do? I mean, Sri Lanka has had a 30-plus year terrorist threat, which has impinged on our economic fortunes. It's left us right back, only to bounce back. And again, we had, that is also a terrorism issue, the Easter Sunday attacks. We're still struggling to come to terms with it, and accountability on all of that. And this, in spite and despite the fact that we have a PTA, and maybe a CTA if it comes to pass. The question is, no matter what you have, you ain't gonna stop the people who are hell-bent on carrying out their brand of terrorism or whatever. And that can only be countered with good intelligence and so on. What do you have to say about that? You know, we had intelligence, and then yet the Easter Sunday attacks happened. We had a PTA then. How do you explain that to the Republic?
Yeah, so I think law is not the answer to a lot of these issues. You're absolutely right to point that out, that you can have the best laws in the world, but you're not going to actually solve problems like, you know, violent extremism or terrorism just by having laws. You have to have a system within society where people feel included. So I wouldn't even discuss it from the point of view of intelligence. I think the problem we have is a problem of social cohesion. The problem that people don't have a sense of belonging within broader society. And there are umpteen number of studies that actually look at this issue. That when people feel marginalized, when people feel discriminated, when people feel powerless, when people feel that injustice is being inflicted on them, they turn to violent discourses. And we have seen this over and over again in Sri Lanka, whether it's the Tamil community or the southern youth, and now the Muslim community. We have had violence emerging from these communities because of this sense of marginalization. I think law is not the answer. I think really it is a larger transformational project that we require, where we actually take our equal citizenship seriously.
And not just a statement in the Constitution, however important the Constitution is.
Absolutely. It has to be the Constitution in practice rather than just the text. So really we have a long way to go until we can recognize this country as a country that does not see people in terms of their ethnicity and religion or gender or whatever identity, but see them as equal citizens. I think the moment we are able to achieve that, the issues we have in terms of violent discourses will also start to, be neutralized over time. I think that's the problem.
And I have somebody saying here, who is going to bail the cat? You've explained it very well, but the person sending me a message is asking who is going to bail the cat then? Who's going to actually do this?
Well, I mean, it cannot be one institution or one person. Everyone has to play a part, right? So voters have to take responsibility for the people they vote for, right? These people don't emerge out of nowhere. We have to take responsibility for the leaders we put in power. the judiciary has a huge role to play, and protecting the independence and integrity of the judiciary is absolutely paramount in all of this. And we have seen whenever the space is given to the judiciary to come forward, judiciary has delivered.
Yeah.
And I think that is an institution that really needs to be protected above all else. Law enforcement has a role to play as well, because when law enforcement decides to use laws selectively, right? Take all these issues in terms of the protest, for example.
Yeah.
We see one set of laws used for protesters and a completely different mindset and framework used for others who gather to celebrate certain, political developments.
Yeah.
Right? So when law enforcement use laws selectively, that's another problem that people feel. There's injustice in this country.
Indeed. And I think our viewers will relate to what you're saying, because we saw it happen. We saw on one day how people were arrested for protesting or something related to that, and when they were granted bail, they came out only to be bundled in and, I dare say, manhandled into vehicles and taken away for 14 days quarantine, almost as though the 14-day quarantine is some sort of item in the penal code, when that is patently not the case.
Absolutely.
And there was nothing to say whether these people were jabbed once, jabbed twice, or whatever. It's very clear that the police don't have the means to implement this thing. It had to be a PHI, and the minister coming out and later post the incident saying, well, we had instructions from the PHI. Even that is not true, because whilst he may have had a letter, it hasn't been gazetted, and the Director General doesn't have that kind of
yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, because the quarantine regulations are very clear. I mean, I have the regulations here.
Yeah.
They don't mention anything on protests or gatherings of that kind.
Yeah.
It does have certain requirements in terms of social distancing and wearing masks, and it also does say that the proper authorities can issue subsequent directives in terms of how to function in public gatherings,
Yeah.
right? But in my mind, we haven't seen what these regulations are or what these directives are, and it's very difficult to conduct yourself in a particular way if you don't have transparency in terms of what the prevailing rules are.
Also, the bottom line is that the people have hundreds of better things to do than to stand on the street and protest, or in the fields or wherever. And the fact is that when they so do, they are moved to doing this because they obviously feel that they've come to the end of their tether, and the only way they can do, or the only thing they can do, is to come out there and protest and hope that some media organizations will pick it up and take their message to a wider audience.
Absolutely, and I think mature governments have to listen to people who protest. When people, you're quite right to point to the desperation. People go to the streets not as a first resort, right? Often people go to the street when they have exhausted other options, and that is an act of almost desperation, because they need to tell their story to the public, and they want the public to see them, right? That's why they go on the street. When that happens, a mature government has to think to itself, we have to listen to what these people have to say, because these are also people who may have voted for us. These are people who are part of the wider constituency, part of the wider public. And I think when you crack down on protests, what it actually does is it displays insecurity. It displays immaturity. So the government can do a lot better in terms of just coping with these types of protests, because these are not mass protests, these are small protests. They're essentially peaceful. A lot of people from different demographics participate. It's not difficult to tolerate these sorts of protests. So I think it's important that the government shows restraint and law enforcement shows restraint when it comes to these protests, because ultimately what these people are doing is expressing themselves and expressing their opposition to certain things that are happening in government, and it's a means of communicating with their leadership. And I think any mature leadership has to be able to listen to those criticisms.
And at the end of the day, one has to balance what this government can do and is doing, because obviously they may well have various things that they are doing, but we have to balance that with their as you said, their insecurity or their apparent insecurity brought about by the analysis of how they're behaving in certain cases. In this case, the way they're handling people who are protesting, because interestingly, the next day or the day after, there was a protest at Lipton Circus, and nobody was arrested, and they sort of dispersed peacefully. The right to peaceful protest is, I believe, enshrined in our Constitution, and all the people are asking is for the Constitution to be upheld, no matter what the EU or the United States or anybody else says and does.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the starting point has to be our own homegrown document. I think international norms are very important because we're part of a global community. We can't ignore our international obligations. But really, when those international obligations align with what is already in our Constitution, it's really a no-brainer. We should be embracing it. And when people go out onto the streets and protest, particularly if they're restrained, if they're peaceful, if they're in small numbers, I think the government has to listen. And it has to show maturity, and particularly a government that enjoys such a majority in Parliament. I think there's nothing for the government to really fear at this stage of its electoral cycle. It really can afford to be tolerant, right? And I think it ought to really approach this issue in a completely different manner. And I'm glad that even subsequent to what happened, if protests are being tolerated, that's at least a course correction. So I'm looking forward to seeing that course correction, and hopefully the government can learn from what has happened with this. And I think a lot of people have been very critical of how even from within government, by the way, how the police handle it. I heard even government ministers criticizing and censuring the police for the way it manhandled certain protesters, and this came from within government. So I think the government has a lot to now reflect on and deal with these issues, because it's not going to stop. There's going to be more protests as the situation unfolds.
The matter is even more difficult to comprehend and to analyze when we realize that our president has spent a fair amount of his working life in the United States and been exposed to the rights and norms of a robust democracy, just as much as he has spent his bigger life here in Sri Lanka, which is also enjoys a robust democracy. So when you see people acting on television the way they did and being shoved into waiting vans or buses or whatever, I would have thought that the president would immediately be horrified, because if he was in the United States and that happened, you know what can happen. We had the Black Lives Matter movement and so on and so forth. So the reaction throughout the United States was and the world was one of deep outrage. So I'm wondering why it is that my president can't see that.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, because actually the way the United States law enforcement dealt with Black Lives Matter was appalling, right? And, the last thing it did was set an example to anyone.
Yes.
And I think it learned from that horrific episode. And there was a lot of introspection and internal criticism of what took place. So I think the last thing we should be doing is try to emulate the US on that particular issue. But having said that, yes, the United States has important institutions that have held together and has been able to actually respond to some of those crises. Even in the aftermath of the recent election, those institutions really came together to make sure that election wasn't overturned. So we have some things to learn from and some things to avoid. And I think it's really important that we pick and choose what to emulate and what to avoid.
Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, thank you very much. And that's the way it was on Newsline Live this evening. Take care, have a great evening, and God bless you. It is now time for the primetime news from News First.